Hi all, thanks so much for joining into the webinar series we're going to be doing on Azure AD B2C. And so each of the different sessions will have two different times to accommodate with different time zones. And then for this week, it'll be the identity protocols. And we'll go ahead and dive in. I'll turn it over to Jenny to present today.
Great, thank you so much, Sophia. All right, welcome to the B2C webinar series on identity protocols, OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. My name is Jenny Ferris, and I'm an engineer working on the Microsoft authentication libraries, and I will be the main presenter today. Also on the call is our program manager for the authentication libraries, Jean-Marc Pierre. He will be fielding the questions in the Q&A throughout the presentation. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Jean-Marc will answer as we go, but we also are planning to have around 10 minutes or so at the end to answer any further questions. Thank you so much for joining this live team event. We're very excited to be here, so let's get started. I'm going to be talking about identity protocols, OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect. Many times for developers, when talking about authentication and authorization, these topics become very complex quickly and often lead to confusion as to how best secure your applications and protect your resources. In this session, we'll go over the details of these two protocols, but then in a follow-up session, I'll show you how easy it is to integrate your applications with Azure AD B2C using the Microsoft authentication libraries and how the complexities of these protocols are hidden from you, the developers. So let's get started. We'll focus on OAuth 2.0. If we take a look back on the evolution of authorization, in the beginning, application developers would create a do-it-yourself model. They would present their customer with the UI and have them enter the username and password directly, which was then stored locally in a database. Hopefully the password was stored securely, but then problems arise when the user wants to change their password or be removed from the database, and the application has direct access to the user's password. Also, if the user wants to sign in with another application, he or she has to enter their credentials again to access the same resource from a different application. As a response to this primitive and insecure way of gaining access to protected resources, OAuth was born. In basic terms, OAuth 2 is about authorization. A user wants to gain access to a protected resource. In other words, what do we want to do? I want to gain access to a protected resource, like the Microsoft Graph User API, or I want to access my own protected API. If my goal is to access a protected resource, then I'm using the OAuth 2.0 protocol. The protocol starts when the user signs into an application, and they are presented a sign-in screen or a login screen like this. You've probably seen something similar. As a user, I have to give consent for the application to have the requested permissions. Basically, OAuth 2 allows a user to grant limited access to their protected resources on a per application basis, without the user having to expose their credentials, as we saw in the do-it-yourself model earlier. So let's go over a very high-level example. Here's the user, also called the resource owner. He or she is going to sign in to a web application. The user hits the sign in button, and a request is sent to the authorized endpoint on the authorization server, which for our examples today is Azure AD B2C. The authorization server then presents the user with the login screen. Here the user is having a private conversation outside of the application with the authorization server. The user will be presented a consent screen where he or she will consent to the required permissions to later access the resource server. The authorization server then redirects back to the client. So before we go further into the OAuth 2 protocol, let's review some basic terminology. First, we have the resource owner. The resource owner is typically the end user, as we saw in the earlier example. The resource owner will grant an application access to a protected resource or API that he or she owns. Then we have the client. The client is the application requesting access to a protected resource on behalf of the resource owner. The authorization server is a server which authenticates the resource owner and issues access tokens. For example, Azure AD B2C is the authorization server in our examples today. The resource server is a server hosting the protected resources or protected APIs that the client wants to gain access to. The authorization grant is a specified flow used to get an access token. The type of grant used depends on your scenario. For example, depending on your type of application, whether it be a desktop, mobile, or web application, you will use one of 4 authorization grant types, which we will cover in a few minutes. The redirect URI is a redirect URI or reply URL is the location that the authorization server will send the user to once the app has been successfully authorized and granted an authorization code or access token. Defining the redirect URI is part of the application registration process. We also have scopes. OAuth2 brings the idea of scopes. The client must ask for authorization to access information on the user's behalf. Scopes then define those specific actions clients can be allowed to do on a user's behalf, such as read the user's contacts or read information about the user. Next, we have the access token. The access token enables clients to securely call protected APIs. For instance, access tokens can be JSON Web Tokens or JWTs, which are base64 encoded and signed by the authorization server. The client should never open or verify the access token. The resource server, on the other hand, will verify the access token as the access token is intended for the resource server and not the client. So how is trust established between the authorization server and the resource server? So we're going to take a quick look at the Azure AD B2C portal, and you can see I have a bunch of applications already created. I'm just going to create a new application. I'll just call it Identity Demo, and I'll make it a web application. And I need to specify a reply URL. I'll just use localhost for now, and then I'll hit create and wait a few seconds. All right, so here's my application that I just created, Identity Demo. I am going to go into API access, and I've already created a protected resource or an API. So I'm just going to go add, and that resource is called the Hello API. And in that Hello API, I have a few scopes like reading permissions, which is demo.read. So I'm just going to hit OK. And now I have access to this Hello API. So I've established trust on the authorization server. If I go to my protected resource, the Hello API, under Publish Scopes, I can see the scopes that this API is requesting access for. So that's how trust is established between the resource server and the authorization server. Now we'll talk about the grant types. With OAuth2, there are 4 specified flows to get an access token. These flows are called grant types. And depending on your scenario, different grant types apply. Authorization code is used by web apps on a server. They will get an authorization code, which will later be redeemed for an access token. When used on mobile apps, Proof Key for Code Exchange, or PKCE, is implemented, which protects against man-in-the-middle attacks. There's also the implicit flow, which is used by JavaScript apps or single-page applications, which execute directly on the user's browser. Resource Owner Password Credentials, or ROPC, involves handling the user's credentials directly in exchange for an access token. And the last grant type is Client Credentials, which is server to server or machine to machine. And now we're going to dive into each of these a little bit more in depth. And we'll start with the authorization code flow. So first, the resource owner, or the end user, will go to the client and sign in. The client will send a request to the authorized endpoint of the authorization server with a response type of code. This alerts the authorization server that the client expects an authorization code returned. The authorization server will then present a sign-in dialog to the resource owner. Once the resource owner authorizes access, the client receives an authorization code. The client, in return, sends the authorization code back to the authorization server, to the token endpoint this time, This communication happens on the back channel, as noted by the dashed line. If the authorization grant is valid, the authorization server will issue an access token and send it back to the client based on the redirect URI that was registered. So the client is exchanging the authorization code for an access token. The client then requests access to the protected resource by the resource server and authenticates by presenting the access token. The resource server will validate the token, and if the access token is valid, the client will have access to the permissions accepted by the user. Now we'll look at the implicit flow. During the implicit flow, the two legs of the OAuth2 protocol are combined. So instead of getting back an authorization code and then redeeming that code for a token, the client will get back a token directly. So again, the client sends a request to the authorized endpoint, but this time the response type is token, not code, as in the authorization code example. We're expecting to get an access token back directly from the authorization server, not a code. The resource owner is again presented with a sign-in dialog and consents to the required scopes. The authorization server will now issue an access token directly to the client. As the communication is happening in the front channel, as noted by the solid lines, the token is acquired directly. The implicit flow for this reason is less secure because the authorization server is returning the token directly on the front channel. So this is why short-lived access tokens are used and refresh tokens are not returned. In the authorization code flow that we saw previously, the communication on the token endpoint happened on the back channel, so it was secure. In the implicit flow, this communication is happening on a front channel, so the access token could be intercepted. The implicit flow is most often used by JavaScript apps or single-page applications executing directly in the user's browser. And then, like before, that access token will be used with a protected resource. The last two grant types are the Resource Owner Password Credential Grant, or ROPC, and Client Credentials. ROPC is mainly implemented to assist older authorization systems and involves the client handling the user's password in exchange for an access token. Downsides to using this flow are the lack of user consent and security concerns around the application handling the user's password directly. This flow is also non-interactive, so there is no UI dialog presented to the user, which means there is no way to handle incremental consent. Say the resource owner gives an application to their photos, and now that same application wants to access their location. Using ROPC, there is no way to now ask the resource owner to consent to more scopes or more permissions. And we will discuss this more in the next session. The last OAuth grant type is client credentials. We won't spend time on this grant, as in B2C, there is no support for client credentials grant. The client credentials grant does not involve a user, as it is for service-to-service or machine-to-machine interaction, and B2C is all about the user experience and is user-centered. So now we'll talk about access tokens, because OAuth2 is all about getting that access token and using it with a protected resource. So what is an access token? Well, there are many types of access tokens, and OAuth2 doesn't define the access token format. But today we'll focus on one of the more common types, which is a JSON Web Token, or JWT, which consists of a header, a payload, and a signature. The header contains metadata about the token and the cryptographic algorithms used. The payload contains the issuer. This identifies the authorization server which issued the token. So it should be the same one that I used with Azure AD B2C. This is defining that authorization server. It also contains the expiration time of the token. It includes the intended audience, so the protected resource. The protected resource is the audience, the audience is what the token is intended for. So in this example, the audience is the client ID of the protected resource on the authorization server. It also contains claims about the resource owner and it contains the scope the resource owner agreed to, in this case, demo.read, and the signature is used to validate the token. These access tokens that we're talking about today are scoped access tokens. So OAuth introduces the concept of scoped access tokens. Remember when the user had to consent to a set of permissions in the dialog box? Those permissions are called scopes. So the access token is scoped to the permissions accepted by the user. The access token is opaque to the client, as it is for the resource server. On the resource server, the access token will be validated and access granted or denied based on the scopes. So this way you can make sure that access to your applications are very direct and targeted. And then if you want to give more permissions, you can change those, and that would be like incremental consent, which we'll talk about later as well. Now let's move on to OpenID Connect. So OAuth 2.0 is all about authorization and was a huge improvement to just collecting usernames and passwords directly. However, application developers wanted to know more about the signed-in user to display specialized content or even just display their name. Using pure OAuth2 makes this impossible because there's no way for the client to verify the access token, as the access token is not for the client. So OpenID Connect is an identity layer which is built on OAuth2. OIDC is about user authentication. OpenID introduces the concept of an ID token, which is a security token that allows the client to verify the identity of the signed-in user. The ID token also contains basic profile information about the user. Because OpenID Connect extends OAuth2, apps can still acquire access tokens to access protected resources. OpenID Connect describes a metadata document that contains most of the information required for an app to do sign-in. The metadata is a JSON document which is found at the well-known endpoint. And you can see here, this is an example of a URL which is going to that well-known endpoint for B2C. It includes the tenant and the domain and the policy. So the information that you would find here in this metadata document includes information such as the URLs to use and the location of the authorization service's public signing keys, the supported response types, such as code for the authorization code, ID token for the ID token, and token for the access token, and different combinations of those, as you can see in the red box. It also contains the supported scopes and the supported claims for a given issuer. In this example, the claims for this B2C policy are identified in the Azure B2C portal under application claims. As the application developer, I can decide which claims I would like to have returned in the ID token, and I can even create my own custom claims, such as jersey number. And then when my application receives the ID token, I can extract the claims and do something with the data, like display specialized content for the customer or lock down certain parts of my application based on the customer's age or location. So after going to the well-known endpoint, we jump back into the OAuth protocol that we followed earlier, except this time we will include another scope in our request to the authorized endpoint, which is OpenID. And now the response type will be ID token. So instead of using code, we're going to use ID token. We would like to get an ID token back from the authorization server. The user, again, is presented with the sign-in dialog and gives consent to the client. And then the authorization server will redirect back to the client with the authorization code. The client will send the authorization code back to the authorization server in exchange for, now this time, an ID token. The client will process the ID token and extract the necessary claims about the user. And since OpenID Connect is built on OAuth2, we can still receive an access token to use with a protected resource. But now we can display a customized UI for the resource owner based on the claims from the ID token. So let's take a look at the ID token. And you can go to jwt.ms if you want to look at an ID token, and we'll do this in the next session next week when we look at integrating applications with the Microsoft authentication libraries. So here's an example of an ID token. An ID token contains information about the signed in user. Similar to an access token, the ID token is also a JSON web token and has three parts: the header, the body, which contains the expiration of the ID token, just like the access token, the issuer or authorization server. So this is the same as the access token value. It's the same authorization server, so those values should be the same. It includes the intended audience. If you remember, the access token, its intended audience was the resource owner. So that's the protected API. In the case of the ID token, the audience is actually the client, because the client is the one making the request. Then we have claims about the resource owner or the user, and these are defined on the authorization server. And we also have the policy for user flow, and this was a policy that was used to obtain the ID token. In this case, it was the sign up, sign in policy. And the ID token, just remember, is for the client. So the client can open the ID token and process the claims inside. All right, so just to summarize, with OAuth 2.0, it's a protocol about authorization and getting access tokens to protected resources. However, OpenID Connect is about authentication and is an identity layer built on top of the OAuth 2.0 protocol. And if you're getting worried this is very complex or seems confusing, you don't have to worry, because we have authentication libraries that can extract a lot of this complexity for you. You don't have to become an expert in OAuth 2.0 and OpenID Connect to have secure applications which sign in users and access protected resources. The Microsoft Identity Platform offers a wide variety of authentication libraries which hide the OAuth2 and OIDC complexities, making it easy for developers to create secured applications. In the next session, integrating B2C applications with the Microsoft authentication libraries, we will start with the scenario. So what type of app are you trying to build? Are you trying to do a mobile application, a desktop application, a web app, a single page application? And then we'll go from there. We'll demo a few of our MSAL libraries and show how they mask a lot of the complexity, enabling you to focus on your customers and leave the authentication to us. So our next steps, hopefully you'll join us for the next session, which is integrating the Microsoft authentication libraries with B2C. And I guess we have like plenty of time for the Q&A. It's a little different to do it without a live audience. But Jean-Marc, I don't know if you're able to join or have any questions from the Q&A.
There are tons of questions in the
Tons
Q&A,
of questions, okay.
But I think they are answered already.
Oh, excellent.
I don't know if you want to talk about the differences between SAML and OpenID, I mean OAuth2 OpenID Connect. There were that is something that came several times.
Would you want to cover that?
So I answered that SAML is already now a legacy protocol, something a bit older than OpenID Connect, OAuth2 OpenID Connect, which is more modern. And one of the aspects is SAML was based on XML. So there were probably it was doing more things in terms of encryption layers and so on, but it had some weight. I mean, in terms of network, XML is not necessarily very lightweight. OAuth2, between other things, has decided to, I mean, OpenID Connect, as Jenny was saying, between other things, has decided to use JSON, which is lighter. That's an example. Then the detail of the protocol, we are more, we know more about OpenID Connect or OAuth2. You can meet, you can have a mixture of things in the case of federations. So for example, Azure AD is capable of federated with other identity providers, in particular on-premise, but not only. And some of them can speak SAML. In the end, the token that will be received by the resource is the token that the resource wants to receive. The resource decides which kind of token it wants. Jenny, anything to add? I think there are no questions. I will go back to my new things.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. I was just answering one right now. Sophia, should we leave the Q&A open for a while? What would you like to do?
Yeah, no, I'm seeing a bunch of questions come in. So actually, Jean-Marc and Jenny, if you guys want to go through some of the questions off mute back and forth, I'm seeing a couple come in and just kind of answer them instead of via text, just verbally, and go through them that way. We can take, a bit of time to go through any questions people may have.
Yeah, ROPC, Jenny, when do you recommend ROPC to be used?
That's a great question. ROPC is really good for testing. So if you just want to test that things are working okay and you need to set up a test environment, we use it all the time for our tests because we can just pull a username and a password from Key Vault and it'll just run without a UI. You don't have to worry about the UI not working or having to figure out what the HTML elements are and what they're named, all the IDs and everything to make sure the elements are going in the right places. You can use it for that. You can also use it for just-in-time migration, which is a common use case for B2C. So you have an on-prem database and you want to move it to the cloud. So with B2C, you can use a just-in-time migration, and they use ROPC for that. But there are limitations with ROPC, especially in B2C. It can only be used with local accounts, is one example, and it has a specific policy tied to it. And like I mentioned earlier, you cannot do, there's no UI, so you can't do incremental consent and things like that. What you don't want to do is create your own UI and use ROPC behind the scenes, because then you're directly handling the user's credentials. So let us handle that for you.
Yeah, which means, Jenny, that users have trust less your application, because it's a question of trust. As a user, having data which is served by an API, I trust an application because I know that the application will delegate to, for example, Azure AD or Azure AD B2C to an authentication server. It will delegate all this dance of getting the credential and getting the token. So I trust, for example, Microsoft to do the right thing. Whereas it's a different story of trusting the application to do the right thing with credentials that I would give it. So it's all a question of trust. Authorization code plus Pixie supported in B2C? That's a good question. Does anybody know? I guess yes, of course.
I just see a question on the relationship between AAD B2C directory and Azure subscription and an AAD directory that governs that subscription. So I know you have to have an Azure AD subscription, and then out of that, you can create an Azure AD B2C directory. And then Jean-Marc, maybe you know more on how all of that is connected, or this might be covered in a later session. I'm not sure.
So I think in a subscription, in an Azure subscription, you can create resources, including an Azure AD B2C. But do you need a subscription to create an Azure AD B2C? I'm not so sure about that. I think probably not. There is a free notion of a free thing, but I think yeah, the Azure subscription will be needed when you want to use features which require a subscription. I would believe. Is there anybody from the B2C team?
No, we could follow up on that one. Someone asked if the post-meeting URL doesn't work. Sophia, maybe you could handle that one. I've just published it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll look into that one.
Thank you.
To come back to the advantage or, comparison between OpenID Connect and SAML, I think one thing Jenny mentioned the consent screen, the fact of consenting. This is one facet, the fact of consenting, but then the authorization server might decide to have a richer dialogue with the user. And this is in the case of Azure AD and Azure AD B2C, directed by policies. And for example, if the tenant admin decides that for a particular application or a particular set of users or both, or for the tenant, it requires to have conditional access. So conditional access means access depending on some conditions. An example is a multi-factor authentication. Then, after the consent string, another dialog will happen to do this multi-factor authentication. And if you don't have a device, if you don't have, let's say that the multi-factor authentication will happen with your phone. If your phone is not registered, this dialog will also include registering your phone to do multi-factor authentication. So that can be very rich, really. And that's a big plus of OAuth2 OpenID Connect.
Thanks, Jean-Marc. Someone had a question, Chris, about, I was told the issuers conceptually both the issuer value and also the B2C policy itself. Should the two values be combined to define security boundaries? I believe you're talking about in the access token. Just going to go back a few slides. So you can see in the issuer, this is the authorization server, but there's no policy defined here. If that's your question, when you have the ID token, you will have the policy because that's for the user, because the policy defines the user flow. And the access token is for the protected resource. So I'm not sure if that answers your question or not. But on the resource server, they will be the ones who will take apart the access token and validate it. I don't believe checking for policy is one of the validations they will do, but you can check for it in the ID token.
There is a good question, Jenny, about the fact that conceptually, so the issuer in the case of B2C is both the ESS value and the B2C policy itself. So why is it so? Do you want to answer this one?
I thought I just did answer that one, but
okay, sorry.
You can.
Sorry, I was
maybe I
answering
answered
another
it
one.
wrong. Maybe I answered it wrong.
No, I was answering another one, so not listening. Yeah, in B2C today, that might change in the future. Today, each policy give birth to, is related to a different STS. It's a different authorization server.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sure, I can talk about. I was just pointing out in the access token itself, there's no policy with the issuer. But when we do the demos next week with MSAL libraries, you'll see that each time we target a specific policy or user flow in B2C, we'll be getting back a separate token because they're actually separate authentication servers. So when we go to the sign-in, sign-up policy, we'll get back a token for the sign-in, sign-up policy, which you can see probably better to show in the ID token. because I have this policy there. And then when I go to, say, edit profile, I'll get a token for the edit profile, but that's coming from a different issuer, from a different authorization server. So then we'll have multiple tokens in the cache. We'll talk about that next week. So I see someone asked about the difference between the audience of the ID token and the audience of the access token. So for the access token, the intended audience is the protected resource. It's the protected web API, for example. So the audience is going to be the client ID of that protected resource. And then for the ID token, since the ID token is for the client, the intended audience will be the client ID of the client. So just think of ID token for the client, audience is the client, access token, the audience is the protected resource. So the client ID audience value will be that client ID of the protected resource.
Yeah, we got an answer for the subscriptions. Andreas said you need to have a subscription when you want to create a B2C tenant, even if you stay in the free tier.
Yeah, that's what I thought. And B2C is working on, having similar features to AAD. So maybe eventually you'll just sign into one portal and you'll have everything there that you need. But for now, you'll have to have an Azure subscription and then a separate B2C tenant. And if you have all that ready to go next week, you can do the demos with me and download the code and we can work on them together.
Jenny, what happens when access token expire?
That's a great question. So with the Microsoft authentication libraries, you'll be getting back an access token and a refresh token. So the access token is short-lived because it's like very powerful. So you can change the expiration date on that, but usually they're have a very short expiration time. And then you'll use the refresh token. So when the access token is expired, the client will use the refresh token to get a new access token refresh token pair. And we'll look at this more when we do the demos next week, because we'll look at what's being stored in the Microsoft authentication library token caches and how the token cache can help you prevent your customers from having to sign in all the time. Because if they have an active session or they have a token in the cache that's valid, we'll just keep using the refresh token behind the scenes, and then the customer won't get prompted all the time. Because it's really annoying when you sign in and then you get prompted and enter your username and password, and then 15 minutes later you're prompted again. So we'll show you how the Microsoft authentication libraries use a token cache. So it's pretty seamless. So we'll look at that next week, but great question.
Oh, no more questions.
Yeah, I don't see any more questions trickling in. I'm going to post the post survey link in the chat window one more time. It's updated thanks to Steven. And so we'll go ahead and give it a minute or two more just to make sure that there are no more questions. But thank you everyone for joining. And if there are no more questions, we can go ahead and close out in a minute.
We have one. How long does access token normally last? It depends. So access token lasts, as Jenny said, I think, did you say 1 hour? For B2C, is it configurable?
Yes, it is configurable. I was going to show them in the portal. Let's see. Oops, no. Under user flows, if I go to, say, the sign in sign up policy. So because I think it was, well, I don't remember who it was. Someone asked about the issuer with the policy. So each policy or user flow in Azure AD B2C is a separate authorization server. It's a separate token issuer. And so everything is set up in the portal based on the policies. So if I go into, I have a sign up, sign in policy here. I can go into properties. And here's where I can change the access token and ID token lifetime. So it's default to 60 minutes. The refresh token lifetime default is 14 days. You can see there's a sliding window lifetime, and I can give that lifetime a length. And you can say I can customize all of these values. Session behavior, I can even change the password complexity. And this will be set for just this policy. So if I want to say my sign in policy, maybe the access token is revoked after, say, 10 minutes, but the refresh token lasts for 14 days. And then if I do an edit profile policy, I can have a different access token lifetime for that policy. So everything in B2C is run off of the policies. And we'll look at this more next week when we actually go through some of our samples that we have. And if you have a B2C tenant, you can do the samples with me and we can play around with some of this. Jean-Marc, do you want to add anything to that? Someone asked, is it possible to get the IDP? I just lost the question in the claim. And you can see here in the application claims, I can get the identity provider. It's a built-in attribute. So I just have to check the ones that I would like to get back, and then it's in the claim. And I can also make custom claims, which I believe is one of the workshops that's coming up.
And Jenny, I think the IDP is the issuer. The issuer claim is the IDP, isn't it?
Yes, it just doesn't have the policy attached to it. And at least right.
Okay, yeah.
Someone asked, can I create different applications with the same policy with different access and refresh token settings? So yes, you can have. These are all of my B2C applications. And then I can target any of the sign-in, sign-up policies that I want based on the application. So if I go to this application, I'm not defining any of the sign-up, sign-in policies here. I will do that in the authentication library. I'll say which authorization server I want to target based on the policy. So you can see I have multiple applications and everything is run off of my user flow, which is the policy. And yes, you can add identity providers. If I go to identity providers here, you can see all the different providers that are offered kind of like out of the box, but then I can add any OpenID Connect provider as well. And what I have to do, so for example, if I was going to add Facebook, I'd have to go into Facebook and create a developer account and set up everything on that end so that it's connected to my Azure AD B2C account. And we have documentation on this. This might be also one of the coming up sessions. But you can see, and then I can decide, again, based on my policy, if I go to this sign up, sign in policy and identity providers. So these are the providers that are accepted with this policy. So when I go to the sign up, sign in authorization server, I can sign in with either a Microsoft account, a Google account, Facebook, or a local account.
Okay, we have some questions about GWE. I hope this is answered. Please tell me if this is not clear. Is it possible to add other identity provider like ADFS?
I answered that.
Okay, you did.
Someone asked about Yahoo as a identity provider. It may not be one of the ones. I don't see it offered here. And I don't know if it would be added as an OpenID Connect one. Possibly. That's a good question. We'll have to follow up on that one.
Can you show how to use the application claims? Is it maybe Divna? Maybe you want to precise your question. You mean for an application token? I don't understand the question. Jenny, I don't know if you know this one. Is it possible to have group membership in token issues by B2C?
I'm not sure on that one on group membership.
We'll get back to you.
About the application claims, so these are claims that I'm getting back with the access token. And then I have user attributes. And we're going to be going over, I believe Jazz is going to go over this in a couple weeks on how you can create like custom application claims and also custom user attributes. But Jean-Marc and I focus mainly on the authentication libraries and integrating with B2C. So getting into like the nitty-gritty parts of B2C and doing the customization, we're not as familiar with that.
Oh wow, we have tons of questions, Jenny. What about the login page customization?
Yes, so the cool thing with B2C is you can log in the entire login screen, which I don't have right here, but we can look at it next week. But every element, it's just HTML. So every element on the login screen can be customized with B2C. And I believe it's one of the workshops that's coming up. So after we show you how to integrate with the authentication libraries, one of the following workshops will be now how can you customize the entire login experience for your customers. And some of the videos they had attached to this webinar showed some examples of how customers have created the unique login experience. And you can also hide a lot of the Microsoft branding and all of that. The nice thing with the Microsoft branding is it gives customers a sense of trust because they know they can trust Microsoft. And when you don't see that, sometimes they don't know, like, can I trust this app? Is it a good app or not a good app? But they'll show you, I believe, coming up how to do all of that. But everything is customizable. That's one of the really great parts of B2C. I see a question about B2C versus B2B. So B2C is business to consumer. So that's where you're going to be using, like where I showed all these identity providers, like Google social accounts, right? Google, Facebook, GitHub. And B2B is where you're going to be using work accounts. So like maybe another Azure Active Directory account. And that for me is an easy way to distinguish between B2C and B2B.
There are two application blades which should be used for each use case. You mean application for the B2C? Oh yeah. Because okay, I can answer verbally for this one. So when you want your application to send in users and call other B2C application, you will use the B2C application blade. When you want to provision users, so when you want to act on the tenant, not on the users, so in that case you want to act as an administrator of the B2C tenant, you would use the other one, which is the AD. I think they are merging now. It's coming if it's not already there.
There's a question on migration of the user from on-prem to the cloud. And does the user password, is it still used? Oh, I believe when you do just-in-time migration with Azure AD B2C, it's using the resource owner password credential behind the scenes. So it'll take what you have in your database and it'll move it to the cloud. And then when the user signs in, if there's a mismatch between the passwords, it'll just recreate a user in the new cloud directory.
Oh, well, yeah. A lot of questions were added without missing guidance on the same. I don't know what the same is. Two application that I handle. There is a question on Google and other IDPs. I don't know if this is a question or an answer. No. The questions at the end are a bit of a mess.
I think it might tie into the one asked about Yahoo. It said the last time I looked at Yahoo, it required hacking around. I'm not, oh yeah, I guess I'm not sure. On the Google and other IDPs, if you could maybe do a follow-up question on that one would be nice. There's one on, can we get multiple emails in claims? I believe you can if you have it set up correctly to get multiple emails accounts.
So we have about 5 minutes left if we want to take a couple more questions and take a couple ones that are kind of overarching. I see a couple around the B2C support for SAML, et cetera, and kind of wrap it up with that. So Jenny, I don't know if you see the one that came in from Sam with the app-specific question of using B2C to log into WordPress. I don't know if that's one that you want to dive into a bit to kind of finish off the session.
We don't really know what WordPress is. I mean, I don't know for Jenny, but
Yeah, that one I'm not sure.
Sorry. Yeah, we.
Okay. Yeah, we can
beyond
follow
our
up.
knowledge.
No, I completely get that. We can follow up.
Yeah. We would love to be educated, but we don't.
No, that's one we can definitely follow up with.
Can we get multiple emails in claims? Emails? Meaning...
I think you can if you have it set up correctly. Like if the user has multiple emails already registered, I believe you can.
So if we're not seeing any other questions, we can give it a minute or two to see if there are any other final ones that are coming in. But to finish off with one final one, I just want to thank both of you for taking the time to jump on today and for everyone on the attendee side for joining the first one of the series. And feel free to give feedback on next steps for us to be able to reach out and help you on your B2C journey. And looking forward to connecting with you. So thank you all so much.
Great, thank you everyone, and great questions. We'll try to follow up with as many of you as possible, or feel free to reach out on email or Twitter.